I drove past my son's house and saw his car in the driveway, a sight that should have filled me with comfort but instead planted a seed of unease. And when I crept closer and heard what was spoken through the window, it shattered me in ways I still struggle to put into words. I remember the evening vividly because it began as nothing more than a detour on a quiet drive, an indulgence of nostalgia that I thought would soothe me after another long day spent in the silence of my own house. But what I found instead burned itself into my memory with a cruelty I could never have anticipated. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. And it began with something as simple as driving past my son's home, the very place I had helped him purchase with loans I had co-signed, money I had quietly given, and sacrifices I had made over decades of work. And as I rolled slowly along the street, headlights dimmed, my eyes caught sight of his car parked neatly in the driveway, its metallic gleam a reminder that I had once been proud of helping him afford things I never had at his age. And yet, instead of pride, I felt something gnawing at me, a sense that I did not belong near this house, that I had become a stranger loitering outside a world I had built but was no longer welcome in. Still, curiosity, or perhaps a father's longing, overcame my hesitation, and I parked a short distance away, telling myself I would only pause for a moment, only look upon the house lit warmly from within, imagining the laughter of family, the sort of closeness I had dreamed of when my late wife and I spent our youth building a future for him. And yet, when I stepped closer, walking carefully across the neatly trimmed lawn, that warmth was stripped away and replaced by something sharp and cold, because through the slightly opened window I heard voices I recognized instantly, my son's low and familiar tone mixed with the sharper inflection of his wife, and I froze, my hand instinctively gripping the sill as though the wood could steady the sudden trembling in my chest. I did not want to eavesdrop, I told myself, but the words pulled me in with a gravity I could not resist, and each syllable I caught felt like a nail driven straight through me. They were not speaking of love or of family or of any fond memory of me. They were speaking of me as though I were already gone, as though my existence was little more than an obstacle to their plans. My son's voice carried a sharp impatience as he remarked that soon I would be too old to manage anything, that the house I lived in should already belong to him, that it was only fair after all the help I had given him in the past. His wife laughed lightly, a cruel sound that made my stomach turn, and she suggested that perhaps it was time to think about legal ways of getting me to hand things over. She spoke of me as if I were a burden, a dotty old man clinging to bricks and mortar instead of realizing it was time to pass everything on, and my breath caught in my throat as I realized I was not overhearing an idle conversation. I was overhearing a plot, casual in tone but lethal in intent. They spoke of my home, my savings, my very independence, as things already half claimed in their minds, and I stood there unable to move, my pulse pounding, my thoughts collapsing into disbelief and pain. How could this be the same boy I had raised, the child whose scraped knees I had once bandaged, whose dreams I had nourished with every ounce of energy I had, now speaking of me as though I were in the way, as though my only value remained in what I would leave behind? I pressed my hand tighter to the window frame, afraid the sound of my ragged breathing would give me away, and I listened as my son's voice hardened further, promising his wife that soon, very soon, they would have everything, and the warmth of the house before me turned into a prison of betrayal, while the night outside felt suddenly colder than it had in years. I froze as their voices slipped through the thin gap of the window and into the night air, each word slicing deeper than the last. my son's voice, carrying that careless arrogance I had tried to ignore for years, as he spoke about me not as a father, but as a problem to be solved. He laughed quietly and told his wife that it would not be long before I became too old to manage anything, that soon enough the affairs I had spent my life carefully maintaining would fall into his hands one way or another. And then she joined in, her tone sharp and dismissive, mocking the way I still insisted on mowing my own lawn, still driving myself to the grocery store, still clinging to independence. She clearly believed I had no right to. She said I was stubborn and foolish, that I had no idea how vulnerable I was becoming, and that if I was smart, I would hand over the house now and save them the trouble of waiting. My heart thudded so hard in my chest that I thought it might give me away, but they were too wrapped up in their poisonous conversation to notice anything outside. I felt my body stiffen against the wall, as though turning to stone might shield me from the words spilling out, yet I could not move. I could not stop listening, and the more they spoke, the more the reality pressed down on me. My son, the boy whose first bicycle I had held steady as he wobbled down the street, was now talking about my home as if it were already his. His wife was egging him on, pushing the idea that the house was wasted on an old man who could barely keep up with it, that I had no business sitting on an asset that could be better used by them. She chuckled and asked him whether I might already be showing signs of losing my mind, whether a court would believe I was too feeble to handle my own estate, and his silence, followed by a dark chuckle, told me he was considering it. My hands trembled as I leaned closer, my fingers gripping the windowsill until my knuckles whitened. I felt as though the air itself had thickened, as though I could not breathe, because it was no longer speculation. It was a scheme, calculated and cruel, to strip me of the very walls that had sheltered them when they needed me, the house that held memories of my late wife, the home I had built with years of sweat and broken bones, suddenly reduced to a prize in their conversation, a piece of property to be won from me. My son's voice dropped lower as he said he was tired of waiting, tired of seeing me cling to something that rightfully should belong to him, and he promised her that sooner than she thought, they would find a way to make it theirs. At that moment, something inside me cracked. A mixture of grief and rage coursed through me. But still I stayed silent, frozen in place, because if I moved, if I made a sound, I feared they would see me not as the father I had always tried to be, but as the fool they had already decided I was, and the thought of that burned hotter than any flame. The betrayal cut into me with a precision sharper than any blade, because as I stood there listening, I realized this was not the careless venting of a tired couple. It was not idle talk said in frustration. It was deliberate and cold, a conversation soaked in calculation, my son's voice hard as stone as he told his wife that they needed to start exploring legal options, that perhaps they could pressure me into signing documents I did not understand, or even challenge my ability to make decisions for myself if I resisted. And hearing those words from the mouth of the boy I had once carried on my shoulders made my entire body stiffen, the blood roaring in my ears as if the very world was collapsing around me. His wife's tone was worse still, sharp and mocking, as she said that I was just waiting to drop dead anyway, that my house was a wasted opportunity while I was still breathing inside of it. And the way she laughed after those words was so venomous that my knees nearly gave out beneath me. I pressed my palm to the rough siding of the house to steady myself, trying to anchor against the dizziness that came with such casual cruelty. They were not grieving an old man before his time. They were strategizing like vultures circling above carrion, stripping me of dignity, before I had even gone cold in the ground, and the realization crushed me. Because I had known disappointment before, I had known disrespect, but never this kind of betrayal, never the sensation of being spoken of as though I were already gone. I thought of the times I had sacrificed weekends to repair that very roof over their heads, of the money I had given freely when their debts were high, of the years I had denied myself small comforts so that they could have more. And now here they were, plotting ways to take from me the last refuge of my life, the home that still carried the scent of my late wife in every corner, the home where we had raised him, celebrated birthdays, buried pets, laughed and cried, now reduced to nothing but property in their scheming conversation. My chest ached with every word they spoke, my son remarking coldly that the law was on their side if they played it smart, that with the right lawyer they could argue that I was no longer fit to manage an estate, and his wife agreeing eagerly, whispering names of attorneys they could reach out to, names that sounded rehearsed, as if they had already begun this process long before tonight, as if this plan had been simmering for months, maybe years, and I stood outside in the dark, shivering, not from the chill of the night, but from the frost settling over my heart, the weight of betrayal suffocating me, because in that moment I understood that they no longer saw me as a man or a father or even a human being, but as a stumbling obstacle in the way of what they believed was theirs. And the pain of that truth was so heavy that I felt as though my very breath might shatter under it. Yet I kept listening, because I needed to know the full depth of how far they had fallen and how little I meant to them beyond what they could strip away. As their voices faded into a cruel background hum, I found myself sinking into the prison of my own thoughts, and what rose to the surface was not the cold night air or the ache in my legs from standing still, but the long catalogue of sacrifices that had brought me to this point, and every memory pressed down on me like the weight of stone, because I had given my entire life to making sure my son would never know the struggles I endured. And oh, I remembered the blistering summers spent breaking my back on construction sites, where the sun burned my skin raw and my hands split open from labor. I remembered dragging myself home late at night, with dust still clinging to my clothes and the taste of exhaustion so thick that food had no flavor. All of it endured because I believed that if I suffered, then he would not have to. I thought of the years it took to build our home with my own hands, hammering nails with calloused fingers, mixing cement until my arms trembled, climbing ladders until my knees buckled, every corner of that house infused with my sweat and my hope. And I thought of how proudly I had walked him through those halls as a boy, telling him that no matter what happened in this world, he would always have a place that was safe, a place that was his as much as mine. And yet now that very promise was being twisted into a weapon against me. I remembered the lean years when money was scarce, and my wife and I skipped meals so that his plate would always be full, the second-hand shoes I wore until the soles split, because I was determined that he would never be the boy teased at school for having less. And as he grew older and his ambitions sharpened, I poured everything into his education, taking extra shifts, pawning heirlooms, even cashing out what little savings I had so that he could go to a good school, never once letting him feel the crushing financial strain that nearly broke me. And when he was older still, eager to carve his place in the world, I co-signed loans to help him start a career, loans that chained me with sleepless nights and cold sweats about what would happen if he failed. But I did it anyway because a father's duty, I believed, was to give without limit. And all along I told myself it would be worth it when he stood proud and independent, when he looked at me with gratitude, when my sacrifices meant he could walk an easier road. Yet as I stood there, pressed against the side of his house, listening to him plot to strip me of everything I had left, I felt the bitter sting of betrayal unlike anything I had ever known, because every bruise, every scar, every weary night had been for him, and instead of gratitude or love, he offered only disdain. And in that moment, the years of sacrifice did not feel like noble acts of devotion, but like weapons I had handed willingly to someone who now aimed them back at me. And I asked myself through clenched teeth, how could a man give everything only to find himself spoken of as if he were already in the grave? How could the blood I shed for him mean so little? And though the pain was suffocating, I also felt a slow and unfamiliar spark in my chest, a whisper that perhaps I was not as powerless as they believed. It was in that moment, standing outside the glowing window that should have been a beacon of family warmth but instead poured poison into my ears, that the realization struck me with a brutality I had never known. Love meant nothing to them. Not the countless nights I had carried my son feverish in my arms, not the years I had bled my body dry so he could walk tall in the world, not the sacrifices my late wife and I had made so that his every need would be met before our own. None of it mattered because, in his eyes, I was no longer a father, no longer a man of flesh and feeling, but a barrier, an obstacle planted inconveniently between him and the property he believed was already his. I saw it with searing clarity now. Every affectionate word he had spoken in recent years had been rehearsed. Every half-hearted visit was not born of love or duty, but of calculation, a way to measure how much longer he would have to wait until I relinquished the house either through death or weakness. And the thought made my stomach twist until I felt sick. I thought back to the times he had rushed through our conversations, his eyes always darting to his phone, his sighs heavy with impatience. Whenever I tried to reminisce or offer advice, I thought of the dismissive tone when he told me not to worry about his life, that I should focus on my own, when really he meant that I should keep myself alive just long enough to hand him the keys to the kingdom I had built. And his wife, with her sharp tongue and cutting laughter, had never seen me as family at all. To her I was a stubborn old man, clutching something she felt entitled to. She had probably whispered these thoughts into his ear night after night until his heart hardened completely against me, and I realized with a cold clarity that the bond between us had been rotting for years. I had just been too blinded by hope to see it. I told myself he was busy, that young men were often thoughtless, that in time he would remember the love that bound us. But standing in the shadows listening to him plot my erasure, I knew that was a lie. He did not love me, not in the way a son loves a father. He loved what I owned. He loved what I could bequeath. He loved the bricks and mortar more than the hands that laid them. And in his mind, my only role left in his life was to vanish and clear the way for his inheritance. The grief of that knowledge pressed against my chest like a crushing weight, a suffocation of the soul, and yet beneath the sorrow a different emotion stirred. An ember of fury and a sense of insult that burned hotter with each breath. Because I was not gone yet. I was not some fading shadow to be brushed aside. And if they thought they could reduce me to nothing more than a stepping stone to their comfort, they were about to discover how wrong they were. As I stood in the darkness with their words still echoing in my ears, smaller memories began to resurface unbidden, like fragments of glass catching the light, each one sharper now that I finally understood the truth behind them. I remembered the ungrateful tone that had crept into his voice over the years, the way he would sigh when I asked him to stop by for dinner, saying he was too busy, that I should not guilt him for having a life of his own, and I remembered how I had smiled weakly and told him it was fine, even though I had cooked his favorite meal and set the table for three, waiting like a fool for a knock on the door that never came. I thought of the dismissive attitude in his words when I tried to share stories of my youth, the way his eyes glazed over as I spoke of the struggles of building our home or the joy of holding him as a newborn, how he would tap his foot impatiently and mutter that he had heard it all before, that I should let go of the past. And I swallowed those slights at the time, telling myself he was young, distracted, that life had hardened him, but now I knew better. Those were not careless habits. They were the cracks of disdain seeping through, hints of how little he valued me outside of what I could provide. And the subtle greed was always there if I was honest with myself. Hidden behind smiles that never reached his eyes, I remembered the time he asked me to lend him money for a new car, even though his old one was perfectly fine. And when I hesitated, pointing out that I was retired and had to watch my savings, he grew cold, muttering that after all I had done for him, it was the least I could do, as if my life's work existed solely to cushion his desires. I remembered when his wife urged me to think about putting the house in both our names, saying it would ease the burden when I was gone, how she had smiled sweetly, disguising the request as concern, and how I had laughed nervously, brushing it off as her being practical. But the truth was already there, her words coated in sugar but driven by hunger. I thought of birthdays where my gifts to him were met with a distracted thank you, of phone calls he answered with irritation in his voice, always too busy, too pressed for time, until he needed something, and then suddenly he found his way to my door, and I, blind with love, always welcomed him. I remembered the Christmas when I gave him the deed to a small piece of land I had worked years to pay off, thinking it would be a legacy for his family, and instead of gratitude, his first response had been a frown and a question about why it was not the larger parcel, as if generosity had to be measured and weighed against his entitlement. Each memory hit me now like a hammer. Every overlooked slight, every half-hidden insult, every greedy request that I had excused because I could not bear to see the truth, they all stacked together into a damning picture, and I realized with a sickening clarity that what I had overheard tonight was not a sudden betrayal. It was the culmination of years of small betrayals I had ignored, and the blindness I once mistook for love now felt like a chain I had wrapped willingly around my own neck, but that chain was beginning to rust, and I felt in the pit of my stomach that it would soon snap. When I finally tore myself away from the window, it felt as though my body was moving on instinct alone, my legs carrying me back to my car with a heaviness that seemed to drag against the earth itself, and yet, as shaken as I was not broken. The words I had heard clawed at me like talons. Yes, but somewhere inside I found a thin thread of strength, a voice that told me I could not crumble now, not when so much was at stake. I drove home in silence. The road blurred through the sting in my eyes, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles whitened. And when I finally pulled into my driveway and stared at the home I had built with my own sweat and blood, I felt the full weight of the evening crash over me. My son wanted to take it. He and his wife had already begun imagining me gone. But as the night pressed down around me, another memory stirred, one that steadied my trembling heart, the memory of my late wife, her voice soft yet firm in my mind. She had always worried about our son's entitlement. I could see her even now sitting across from me at the kitchen table years ago, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, her brow furrowed as she said she feared we had given him too much, that love without limits might turn into expectation, and I had laughed it off at the time, telling her that he was just young, that in time he would see how much we had done for him. But she had not laughed. She had only looked at me with that knowing sadness in her eyes, the kind of sadness only a mother can carry when she sees truths she does not want to speak aloud. She had whispered that one day he might not see us as parents at all, but as stepping stones to something bigger, that he might confuse sacrifice with obligation, and that when we were old and fragile, he might not protect us but press us for what remained. Her foresight had unsettled me back then, but I had buried it under layers of denial because the idea that our own son could turn on us seemed unbearable. Yet tonight, her words came back like prophecy fulfilled, echoing so sharply that I could almost feel her hand on mine, reminding me that she had tried to prepare me, that her intuition was not born from cynicism, but from love and caution. And as I sat in the dark of my living room, the silence loud enough to make my ears ring, I let myself lean into that memory of her. I let her voice ground me, and I realized I could not afford to fall apart. She had seen this possibility long before I had, and though the ache of missing her cut deep, I found strength in her foresight, because perhaps in her quiet wisdom she had left me more than warnings. Perhaps she had left me tools I had yet to uncover, and the thought of that sparked something in me, a faint glimmer of hope in the middle of the storm. The house was silent as I moved from room to room, each step heavy yet driven by a strange sense of purpose that had not been there when I first staggered through the front door. My wife's voice lingered in my mind like a lantern in the dark, and I could not shake the feeling that she had left me something more than warnings. She had always been practical, meticulous, and cautious in ways that balanced my willingness to trust. And so I went to the old cabinet in the study where we kept our most important papers, a cabinet I had not opened in years, my hands trembling as I sifted through folders yellowed with time, bills long paid, insurance policies filed away. And then I found a thick envelope with her handwriting across the front. My breath caught as I slid it open and pulled out a stack of documents carefully bound together. At the top was a note in her graceful script, written years before her passing, and as my eyes traced her words, I felt her presence as though she were sitting beside me again. She wrote that if I was reading this, it meant I had begun to doubt our son's intentions, that she prayed it had not come to this. But if it had, she wanted me to know she had made provisions to protect me. My fingers shook as I turned the pages and discovered the layers of foresight she had woven quietly into our lives. There were trusts established in my name that locked away certain assets until my death, with strict stipulations that they could not be accessed by anyone else. There were hidden accounts I had never known about, modest but secure, meant to ensure that even if the worst came to pass, I would never be left destitute or dependent on anyone's mercy. She had also placed conditions in our will that required mental competency evaluations by independent professionals before any changes could be made to property deeds or financial accounts, protections against exactly the kind of manipulation my son and his wife had been discussing. And as I read line after line of her careful planning, a wave of relief and heartbreak surged together in me. Relief that she had seen the danger I had refused to acknowledge, and heartbreak that she had carried this burden alone, silently preparing for a betrayal she hoped would never arrive. I pressed the papers to my chest and closed my eyes, whispering a thank you into the stillness of the room, thanking her for loving me so completely that even from beyond the grave she was still shielding me from harm. The rage and grief I had felt outside my son's house only hours before now, mixed with something new, a steel-like resolve. Because I was not powerless as they imagined, I was not at their mercy. I was fortified by the wisdom of the woman who had known me best. And as I spread the documents out across the desk, reading every clause and every safeguard, I felt a sense of armor forming around me, one they would never see coming. They thought I was an old man too weak to fight, but thanks to her, I had weapons they did not even know existed, and for the first time since hearing their cruel words, I felt the faintest spark of control returning to my veins. As I sat at the desk surrounded by the documents she had left behind, a strange and powerful feeling surged through me, something I had not felt in years. It was gratitude first, sharp and overwhelming, because even in her absence my wife had found a way to reach across time and protect me. She had seen what I could not bear to see, and she had prepared for it with a quiet determination that left me humbled. I whispered her name into the empty room, my voice cracking with both sorrow and awe, thanking her for being the shield I had not known I would need. And then alongside that gratitude came a renewed strength, a current of energy rushing through my veins, replacing the despair that had threatened to swallow me only hours before. I was not helpless. I was not the frail old man my son and his wife mocked so easily. I had tools now, protections crafted with foresight and love, and suddenly the betrayal I had overheard no longer felt like the death sentence it had seemed. Instead, it felt like a battle cry, a call to rise and defend the life I had built. I thought of how they had spoken of me, just waiting to drop dead, a stubborn relic in the way of their comfort, and a grim smile tugged at my lips because they had no idea that their schemes were already doomed by the very woman they dismissed as gone and forgotten. My wife had left me weapons sharper than any blade, legal structures they could not easily pierce, hidden assets they could not touch, conditions that tied their greedy hands before they could even lift them. And with each page I read, each safeguard I uncovered, I felt a fire stoke itself inside me, a fire that whispered I could fight back, and I would not only defend myself but show them the depth of their miscalculation. I leaned back in my chair and looked around the house, the photographs on the walls, the worn furniture we had chosen together, the life carved into every corner, and for the first time since hearing their cruel voices, I did not see fragility. I saw resilience. I saw a fortress standing firm against storms, and I realized that this home, my life, my dignity, were not theirs to take. Not now, not ever. My wife's foresight had given me a second chance, not just at protecting what I owned, but at reclaiming the power they thought they had stripped from me. I was not waiting to die. I was preparing to live on my own terms. And as I gathered the papers into a neat pile, my hands steadier now, I promised her memory that I would honor her efforts by standing tall, that I would not let her work be in vain, that I would fight back with the strength she had given me. And in that promise I felt something like peace. The storm of betrayal still raged around me, but in its center there was calm resolve, a certainty that I was not finished, that I had only just begun. The following morning I rose with a clarity of purpose that steadied my every step. The doubts that had plagued me the night before replaced with determination as I gathered the folder of documents my wife had prepared and set out to consult a lawyer. The air outside was brisk, biting, but instead of shrinking from it, I felt it fuel me, reminding me that I was still alive, still capable. And as I drove into town, I rehearsed what I would say, the words tumbling through my mind with a rhythm born of urgency. When I finally walked into the lawyer's office and sat across from the polished wooden desk, I laid out the papers with a care that bordered on reverence, my voice low but steady, as I explained what I had discovered and why I had come. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed man with years etched into the lines of his face, took his time reading through every page, his brow rising slightly as he examined the trusts, the hidden accounts, and the competency conditions. When he finally looked up at me, there was something like admiration in his expression. He said my late wife had been brilliant, that the protections she had put in place were airtight, the kind of measures even seasoned manipulators would struggle to work around, and hearing that validation was like a balm on the raw wound in my chest. It meant that her foresight had not only been loving but legally sound, a fortress built of clauses and signatures. But before relief could fully settle in, he leaned forward, his tone growing serious, and told me that while the legal structures were solid, my son and his wife might still attempt to challenge me, not by breaking the documents themselves, but by attacking me as their weakest link. He warned that it was not uncommon for greedy family members to try to prove an elder unfit, to argue that age or declining health made them incapable of managing their own affairs, and, if they succeeded, control could slip from my hands despite the protections. His words hit like a cold wave, not because they were surprising, but because they named the very shadow I had already begun to fear. I could almost hear my daughter-in-law's mocking voice again, suggesting I was forgetful, hinting at senility, planting seeds of doubt, and the lawyer confirmed what I already knew in my bones, that they would not hesitate to drag me into court, to paint me as a doddering old man clinging to a life too big for me. I sat in silence for a moment, my fingers tightening on the armrests of the chair, and then I asked him plainly what I could do, what steps I should take to ensure they had no ground to stand on. He told me to begin documenting everything, to keep meticulous records of my decisions, to undergo regular evaluations from doctors to certify my mental fitness, to leave a paper trail that would dismantle any accusation they hurled at me. And as he spoke, I felt that resolve inside me harden further, because I would not give them an inch. I would not let their lies define me. When I left his office that afternoon, with the folder tucked securely under my arm and a new list of tasks in my mind, I knew I had not just walked in for reassurance. I had walked out with a battle plan, one that would turn their own underestimation into the very thing that destroyed them. As I drove home from the lawyer's office, the rhythm of his warning echoed in my head, louder than the hum of the engine or the rush of wind against the glass. And for the first time, I allowed myself to truly picture it, the possibility that my own child, the boy I had once cradled against my chest and soothed to sleep, might stand in a courtroom and call me senile, might look a judge in the eye and argue that I was no longer fit to manage my own life. The thought sent a cold shiver down my spine, fear curling itself tightly in the pit of my stomach. I imagined the humiliation of strangers debating my competence, of my memories and decisions dissected as if I were some confused old man who had wandered into the wrong place, and that image gnawed at me, stripping away the layers of dignity I had spent my life protecting. For a fleeting moment, I felt small, exposed, as though the betrayal I had overheard was not only real but unstoppable, because how could a father defend himself against the lies of his own flesh and blood? How could I prove the clarity of my mind when the very act of defending it might be spun as proof of decline? But then, as the weight of that fear pressed harder, another voice rose within me, the same voice that had carried me through nights of endless labor, through grief and loneliness after my wife's passing, through every hardship life had placed before me. And that voice whispered that fear was exactly what they counted on, That fear was the very weakness they hoped would make me surrender, and slowly that fear began to change shape, transforming into something sharper, something harder. Like iron heating in a forge, I gripped the steering wheel tighter and let the fear burn itself into resolve, a promise that if they tried to strip me of my dignity, I would fight them with every breath left in my body. They might call me senile, but I would be armed with medical evaluations proving otherwise. They might call me incapable, but I would leave behind records of every precise decision I made, and they might try to stand me before a judge, but I would stand taller than they expected, unshaken and armed with truth. I thought of my wife again, of the careful protections she had left me, and I realized that she had not only given me legal tools, but had given me the faith that I could rise above this betrayal, that I was stronger than the shadows my son had cast over me. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the fear had been burned away, leaving only resolve coursing through me like steel in my veins. I stepped out of the car and looked up at the house that had been the stage for so much of my life, and I swore aloud into the quiet evening that I would not let them take it, that I would not let them take me. And in speaking those words, I felt something shift inside me, as though the old man they thought they knew had died, and in his place stood someone new, someone ready for battle. From that night forward, I became a man with a mission, every hour of my day shaped by the knowledge that my son and his wife were waiting for the smallest crack to pry open and exploit, and so I vowed to give them nothing, no weakness, no oversight, no chance to twist truth into lies. I began by scheduling medical checkups, not the casual kind where a doctor glances at a chart and sends you on your way, but thorough evaluations, cognitive tests, memory assessments, everything that could confirm my mind was sharp, and each time the results came back clear. I tucked the papers away neatly into a binder that would one day stand as my shield in a courtroom if necessary. I even asked the doctors to write statements, brief notes certifying my fitness to handle my own affairs. And though at first they looked at me with curiosity, I explained simply that I valued my independence and wanted to preserve it. None of them needed to know the uglier truth behind my request. Next, I turned to my finances, spreading documents across the dining table until the wood beneath them was hidden under neat stacks of order. I made lists, updated accounts, and recorded every transaction with meticulous care. I created folders not just for myself, but for anyone who might one day need to see proof that I was deliberate, logical, and entirely in control of my estate. There would be no careless errors, no missing pieces they could twist into evidence of incompetence. I even began keeping a journal of daily activities, a simple record of what I did, where I went, what decisions I made, so that there was a trail showing the clarity of my thoughts, the deliberateness of my actions. And though it felt strange at first, it soon became a source of strength, a living record of my capability. And as I wrote each entry, I imagined the look on their faces if they ever tried to suggest I was losing my grip. The journal would shout the truth louder than any of their lies. I met with my lawyer again and showed him what I had begun to build, and for the first time, he smiled at me with something more than professionalism. He smiled with respect, telling me that few men had the foresight or the discipline to prepare so thoroughly. His words fueled me further, and I tightened my routines, making sure that every piece of my life was accounted for, organized, and impenetrable. In the evenings when I sat in the quiet of my home, I felt the weight of loneliness pressing in, but I also felt a strange kind of empowerment, because I knew that even in solitude, I was not helpless. I was laying the groundwork for a defense so strong that my son's greed would break against it like waves against stone. I would not give them any opening, not a single flaw to exploit, and in this meticulous preparation I discovered something unexpected. I was not merely defending myself, I was reclaiming control, piece by piece, of a life they thought was already theirs. It did not take long before my suspicions were confirmed and my son began to show his hand. At first it was subtle. Little remarks slipped into conversation like poison disguised as honey. He would chuckle lightly when I paused too long to recall a detail and say things like, "Dad's forgetfulness is getting worse, isn't it?" As if he were speaking to himself, but loud enough that I could hear. I saw the smirk flicker across his wife's face each time, a glint of satisfaction that told me they thought their plan was unfolding perfectly. During one visit, he walked through my house with a critical eye, running his fingers across the dust on a shelf and shaking his head before saying, "Maybe it's time we thought about a caretaker for you, Dad. Someone to help you manage." And though his tone was dressed in concern, the words dripped with manipulation. It was not care he was offering, but control. He wanted me to admit weakness, to open the door to their scheme, and I watched him carefully, my face calm, while inside I could feel the fire of anger burn hotter with each word. I remembered the lawyer's warning, and I knew exactly what game he was playing, planting seeds of doubt, watering them with casual remarks until others would begin to believe the image of me as a frail old man slipping into confusion. But what he did not know was that I was prepared, every doctor's note tucked safely away, every journal entry written with clarity, every financial decision recorded with precision. Still, the audacity of hearing him speak to me that way, as though I were already slipping into uselessness, cut deeper than I wanted to admit. One evening over dinner, he leaned back in his chair and looked at his wife before saying, "Maybe Dad should start letting us handle the bills. It's too much for him now." I let the silence stretch, staring at him until the weight of it forced him to look away. He laughed awkwardly then, muttering that he was only joking, but I could see through the facade. There was no joke in his words. There was only intent. They were circling me like wolves, testing the fence, looking for a weakness, and it struck me with both grief and grim clarity that they no longer saw me as a father at all, but as prey. I clenched my jaw and offered no reaction because I understood that reacting now would only feed their narrative. Instead, I nodded slowly, feigning the absent-mindedness they expected, letting them believe they were clever, while inside I was sharpening the blade of patience, waiting for the perfect moment to show them that every cruel comment, every false display of concern had been heard and remembered. They thought they were tightening the noose, but all the while I was standing tall within it, biding my time until I could pull it from my neck and place it firmly around theirs. On the surface, I became the picture of calm compliance, nodding when my son dropped his barbed comments, smiling faintly when my daughter-in-law's false concern dripped into her voice. But beneath that still mask, I was a man taking notes with the precision of a soldier on reconnaissance. Every remark about my supposed forgetfulness, every suggestion that I was too tired to manage my home, every casual mention of a caretaker was etched into a ledger I kept hidden, both on paper and in my mind. And when I returned to the quiet of my house, I would sit at the table and document it all, writing the exact words, the dates, the expressions on their faces, even the tone in which they said it, because I knew that one day these small details might serve as weapons sharper than their lies. I began saving voicemails where his impatience slipped into veiled insults, recording the times they pressured me to sign documents or suggested handing over responsibilities, all reunited. I kept every text that carried the sting of their disregard, and while they thought they were tightening their grip, I was gathering rope to bind them. Outwardly, I gave them nothing. No anger, no defensiveness, no spark of resistance they could twist into proof of instability. Instead, I let them talk. Let them reveal themselves piece by piece, and the more they grew comfortable, the crueler their words became. My son once muttered that it was pathetic. How long I insisted on clinging to the house, that it was sad for an old man to think he could manage alone, and I only smiled faintly, as if I had not heard, but in my mind I stamped those words in bold ink onto the page of my journal. Their arrogance became my advantage, and I realized that letting them underestimate me was the most powerful weapon I had, because while they saw an aging father drifting into weakness, what they did not see was the fortress of evidence I was building brick by brick. Their cruelty was not breaking me, it was exposing them, and with every cruel word they spoke I grew stronger, more certain, more prepared, and though the silence of my home still ached when I returned each night, I began to welcome it, because in that silence I could hear clearly the truth they thought I was too feeble to grasp. They had already condemned themselves with their own tongues, and I would be ready when the day came to reveal it. It was she who pushed the hardest, her voice sharp and eager whenever I was within earshot. Though she often disguised it as idle chatter with my son, I caught her urging him to consider legal action more than once, planting the idea like a seed and watering it with her venom. She spoke of fast-tracking the inheritance as if my death were a mere inconvenience, delaying their comfort, her tone always carrying that bitter edge of impatience, and my son, weak to her prodding, would nod and grunt in agreement, his words growing bolder as the weeks passed. Once she even asked aloud whether it might be easier to prove I was unfit now, rather than waiting for nature to take its course. Her laughter after saying it chilled me to the bone, not because it surprised me anymore, but because of how easily she spoke of erasing me from my own life. I would sit quietly in my chair while they spoke in the kitchen, pretending to read a newspaper or gaze out the window, and each time they let slip another piece of their scheme, I noted it, carefully recording the language, the intent, the venom. My outward calm gave them confidence. They believed I was deaf to their cruelty, or too clouded in mind to understand, and that arrogance blinded them to the truth, that every whisper of greed, every plan spoken within the walls of my house, was strengthening my position. Their impatience was my armor, their schemes my ammunition, and while they sharpened their knives in plain sight, I was already wrapping myself in protections they could not pierce. What neither of them knew was that I had copies of my medical evaluations stored safely, that I had signed affidavits from doctors attesting to my fitness, and that my finances were organized with a clarity that would embarrass their assumptions. They laughed about me being an old man fumbling through papers, not realizing those papers were shields and swords alike. Sometimes I would watch her eyes narrow as she looked around my home, her gaze not falling on photographs or memories, but on furniture, on property, on value, always calculating what would soon be hers. And though grief pressed heavy in my chest, I let her think she was winning. I let her stoke the flames of her husband's greed, because their hunger was consuming their vision, blinding them to the fact that they were walking willingly into the very trap their arrogance had created. And in those moments I felt not despair but a grim satisfaction, because I knew when the time came their laughter would falter, their greed would turn to ash, and they would finally see that the man they thought helpless had been preparing all along. The moment I had been waiting for finally arrived on a gray afternoon, When the sky outside hung heavy with rain, my son appeared at my door with a thin smile that did not reach his eyes, his wife hovering just behind him with a stack of papers tucked neatly into a folder. They moved with a kind of false cheer, speaking too quickly, their voices pitched higher than usual, as though they could mask their intentions with forced brightness. After some shallow pleasantries, he cleared his throat and set the folder on the table before me, sliding a pen across the wood as if it were a gift. He said these were just some routine documents that would help simplify things, help me manage. He used words like streamline and secure, as though he were a banker offering advice instead of a son trying to strip his father of everything he owned. I leaned back in my chair and let my eyes drift lazily over the papers. Though inside my heart beat steady with anticipation, I asked him what exactly the documents meant, my voice calm but pointed, and he faltered slightly, his wife quickly stepping in with a chirping explanation about making sure the house and finances were easier to handle, about protecting me in case I became forgetful. I looked at her long and hard, then back at him, and asked directly if these papers would change ownership of my home. The silence that followed was telling. His jaw tightened before he muttered something about how it was just a formality, nothing significant. I pressed further, my questions sharp and deliberate, each one cutting through their rehearsed lines. What did this clause mean? Why was my signature required there? Who would be listed as the beneficiary? With each inquiry their facade cracked, my son stumbling over words, his wife interrupting with vague reassurances, until finally the truth spilled out in fragments too jagged to hide. It was not about protecting me, it was about transferring control, about placing the house and assets in their hands under the guise of helping me. I watched their faces as I asked if they thought I had become so weak, so blind, that I would sign my life away without question. My son flushed red, his voice raising defensively, accusing me of being paranoid, of mistrusting him after all he had done, and I could not help the bitter laugh that escaped me, because in that moment his lies lay bare on the table between us, and I realized that the game had shifted. They thought they had cornered me, but instead I had lured them into showing me exactly who they were, predators too arrogant to notice their prey had grown teeth. I pushed the papers back toward him slowly, meeting his eyes with a calmness that unsettled him, and told him I would need time to consider, though in truth there was nothing to consider. What mattered was that I had drawn them out, exposed the depth of their betrayal with their own words and signatures, and as they left in frustration, the folder clutched tight in his hands. I sat in the silence of my home and felt the first true stirrings of victory, because they believed they had tested my weakness, but all they had done was reveal their own. The storm broke not outside but inside my living room on the day I decided to end the charade. My son and his wife arrived again, their smiles stretched thin over greed, their words dressed in false concern. But I had grown tired of their performance, and the time had come to strip away the mask. I invited them to sit, poured tea with hands steady as stone, and when they began their careful dance of hinting at caretakers and responsibilities, I raised a hand and silenced them, my voice calm but firm as I told them I had something important to share. I watched their eyes light up with anticipation, no doubt expecting me to finally surrender to their scheme, but instead I laid a folder on the table, one they had never seen, filled with the protections my late wife had set in place years ago. I told them plainly that all assets were protected by trusts and legal conditions, that the will had been rewritten long before they began plotting, and that nothing they did, no manipulation or pressure, could touch what I had built. I explained that my wife had seen through them long before I had, that she had worried about their entitlement when they were still young, and in her wisdom she had made sure that if greed ever guided their steps, the path would lead to nothing. My son's face went pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, while his wife's composure shattered instantly, her voice sharp and shrill as she demanded to know what I meant, how it could be possible. I looked at her with a coldness I had never allowed myself before and told her it was not only possible but already done. My wife's foresight had seen to it, and I had fortified her work with medical records, financial order, and evidence that proved beyond doubt that I was of sound mind and capable hands. Their greedy ambition had walked straight into the walls she had built. My son slammed his hand on the table, accusing me of betrayal, saying it was unfair after all he had done for me, and I leaned forward, meeting his anger with quiet certainty, asking him what exactly he believed he had done besides take, demand, and diminish the love of the parents who had given him everything. His rage faltered then, because there was no answer he could give, only silence. And into that silence I declared that the house, the savings, and every piece of my estate were locked away from their reach, bound to conditions they could not break, and that when my time came, they would inherit nothing, not even the keys to the front door. My voice did not tremble, my hands did not shake, and the power in that moment was not born from cruelty but from truth. The truth that I was no longer the vulnerable figure they thought me to be, but a man protected by the love and foresight of a woman who had known their hearts long before I dared to admit it. And as they sat in stunned silence, the weight of their failure pressing down on them, I felt for the first time in months the lightness of victory rising in my chest. The moment the weight of my words settled into the air, my son's composure cracked like thin glass, and what burst forth was not sorrow or regret, but a torrent of rage. His face flushed crimson, his fists clenching at his sides as he shouted accusations at me, calling me selfish, cruel, a traitor to my own blood. Each word spat with venom that stung sharper than any slap. His wife sat rigid beside him, her eyes wide with fury. But it was his voice that filled the room, echoing off the walls as though he could drown me with the sheer force of his anger. He accused me of abandoning him, of favoring the memory of my late wife over my living family, of hoarding wealth that by right belonged to him. And when I simply sat in silence, letting him burn himself out, his words grew darker, more desperate, until he screamed that I was senile, that I was too old and confused to understand what I was doing, that the law would see it, that no one would believe I was in my right mind. The insult hit me like ice, not because I believed it, but because it revealed the truth of his plan laid bare at last. And though my heart twisted at hearing my own flesh and blood reduce me to a caricature of weakness, I remained outwardly calm, my gaze steady, my breathing slow, for I had been prepared for this very moment. Before they arrived, I had set my phone on the table, its camera angled discreetly, recording every second of the exchange, each accusation, each insult, each declaration that I was unfit to handle my own affairs, captured not by my memory alone but in undeniable proof, as his fury spiraled into threats of legal action and his wife's shrill voice joined the chorus, demanding I hand over documents, demanding I explain myself. I felt a grim satisfaction settle into me, because they were not just exposing themselves to me, they were exposing themselves to the world, every cruel word and manipulative tactic preserved, a damning portrait of greed and malice that would silence their lies before any judge. I let them rage, let them spit their venom, because the longer they spoke, the deeper the hole they dug for themselves. And when finally his voice broke with exhaustion, when his chest heaved with shallow breaths and his face was contorted with bitterness, I leaned forward and told him quietly that he had just made my case stronger than I ever could have on my own. His eyes flickered with confusion, then panic as he realized too late that his outburst had been his undoing. And though part of me ached to see the boy I had raised reduced to such a cruel stranger, another part of me felt only resolve. For now, I held not only the legal protections my wife had left me, but the living evidence of their betrayal. And with both, I was untouchable. I let the silence stretch until their anger began to falter, until the weight of my steady gaze pressed heavier than any words, and then I spoke, my voice low but unshakable, carrying the finality of a gavel striking wood. I told them that whatever bond had once tied us together had been severed by their greed, that they were no longer my family, but predators who had circled my life, waiting for the moment they thought I was weakest. I reminded my son that a father is not a wallet, not a deed, not a signature on a line. A father is a man who gives his life to raising his child. And I had done exactly that, sacrificing years of sweat and health so that he would never know hunger, never know the desperation that marked my youth. Yet instead of gratitude, he had turned into a vulture, circling not because of love but because of entitlement. His wife flinched at the word predator, but I did not soften it. I said it again, letting it hang heavy in the air. And then I told them with complete clarity that from this moment forward, they would have no claim on me, not legally, not financially, not emotionally. I explained that every asset was protected, every document reinforced, every safeguard locked tight. Their schemes were as useless as their pleas, and that even if they tried to drag me before a judge, the evidence of their manipulation and my clarity of mind would expose them for exactly what they were. I could see the fury in my son's eyes shifting into something more brittle, a glimmer of fear as he realized he had truly lost. His wife sputtered with indignation, demanding I take back my words. But I only shook my head slowly, telling them I owed them nothing, that the man they thought they could break had already buried the version of himself that clung to hope they might change. I declared that I would live the rest of my days free of their reach, that the home they coveted would never be theirs, that when my time came, it would pass to those who valued honor over greed, and that as for them, they would inherit nothing but the memory of the day they revealed their true selves. I stood then, pointing to the door, not with rage but with certainty, telling them to leave my house, my sanctuary, and never return, and though they hesitated, their faces twisted with shock, they saw in my eyes that the decision was immovable, and slowly they left, their voices trailing into silence as the door closed behind them. I stood alone in the quiet, the echoes of betrayal still fresh, but for the first time in months, perhaps years, I felt no fear, no doubt, because I was protected not only by law but by resolve. Their reach could no longer touch me, their words could no longer wound me. They were strangers now, and I was free. That night, when the house had finally gone still and the last echoes of their footsteps faded into memory, I sat alone in the living room, the soft hum of the clock on the wall marking the passage of time, and I let myself breathe, truly breathe. For the first time in what felt like years, the home I had built with my own hands, brick by brick and board by board, surrounded me with a strength I had almost forgotten it carried. No longer did it feel like a target. No longer did it feel like something teetering on the edge of being stolen. It felt like a fortress, impenetrable, every wall humming with the love and foresight my late wife had left me, every corner secured not only by legal protections, but by the quiet resolve that had grown in me through this ordeal. I leaned back in my chair, the wood creaking softly under me, and I let my eyes wander across the photographs on the mantel, reminders of years filled with laughter, with sacrifice, with dreams that had once seemed unshakable. And though the grief of losing my son to greed cut deep, deeper than words could capture, I found that grief no longer ruled me. It no longer held me in its jaws. Instead, it existed beside something stronger, a profound peace. Because I knew I had done all I could, I had given him every chance, every gift, every sacrifice. And in the end, it was not my failure, but his choice to walk the path he had chosen. I whispered my wife's name softly, thanking her once more for her foresight, for saving not only the home we had built, but the dignity of the life we had lived. I thought of how she would smile if she knew that even now she was protecting me, how she would rest easier knowing her husband had not been undone by betrayal. And as I sat there, I realized that justice had been served, not in a courtroom or in some dramatic spectacle, but here, in the quiet certainty that their greed had been turned back on them. I felt the weight of my estate, my savings, my legacy, all of it resting safely where it belonged, untouchable by hands that had tried to seize it. And I felt the dignity of my life's work stand tall within me, unbroken. I knew the road ahead would not be without loneliness, that the absence of my son would ache in unexpected moments. But I also knew that in protecting myself, I had honored the sacrifices of the past and preserved the future of what truly mattered. As the clock ticked on and the night deepened, I allowed myself to close my eyes, not in defeat but in peace, because I had faced betrayal and I had endured, and in the end, I had reclaimed not only my home but my strength, and for the first time in far too long I felt whole. Your time means a lot. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.